Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to be conference speaking again. It's been kind of weird with COVID and everything, and it's just real nice to meet up virtually with people and learn some Python, and I'm really excited to be here today. And going to talk about secure development in Python. And I think it should just be a really great time and really approachable for anyone who's a beginner through advanced. The advanced people, it might just be useful to consider what your teammates who are less knowledgeable about security, what they're going through and how you can help them level up. And so yeah, let's get it started. And one of the questions I had when developing this talk is I said to myself, well, how am I going to discuss security with these folks? And I decided that given everything that's happened this year, we need some whimsy and some mystery. And so that's how we're going to talk about security today. And we have some really excellent guests, I would call them. And they are Hercule Poirot, Sherlock Holmes, and Hiss Marple. Now, I was very, very excited about those puns, but I do not have the consistency to keep up with them throughout this talk. So we're going to be discussing security with the help of some of our favorite British detectives, Hercule Poirot, Sherlock Holmes, and Miss Marple, and learning from them how to think about security and how to apply security. And you also have me as a snake because I couldn't help myself. All right, so let's meet our detectives. First, we have Miss Jane Marple. She's a bit of a busybody. She knows a lot, arguably too much about her neighbors. She's often underestimated, and she is always listening, and she is thoroughly educated, but she has no official role. So she's just super great. And then we have Hercule Poirot. Poirot understands psychology, and he believes in the predictability of human behavior. So he often will solve crime by understanding why a crime occurred and being able to back it out to who would have done it. He's fastidious, and he keeps his cards close. He can spot when someone is pretending to be someone they are not. And then, of course, we have Sherlock Holmes. Holmes observes minute details. He knows you don't necessarily need to leave your home to dig up some interesting information. He's a thorough researcher. He questions assumptions, and he ignores rules when they don't suit him. All right, and then there's me, or more specifically, past me. So I do not have, or I was a typical Python developer. I didn't have any particular training in security, and then I got hired by a security company. And my role was kind of to be the everyman, you know, give a perspective of someone who is new to security, that sort of thing. So past me might have been a little naive. Past me didn't want to believe people would do anything bad. She thought that she was working on things that weren't important enough for someone to break in. And she thought that security seems overwhelming or like it's someone else's concern. And so this talk is for this past me and for people, developers in similar situations. And we're just going to learn a little bit about where Python and security meet, and how to think about your code holistically from a security perspective. All right, so I have several questions for our detectives, and I'm I'm going to use those to discuss introductory security concepts. So let's go. All right, the first question is, what do you know about your neighbors? And by this, I mean that understanding vulnerabilities in your open source dependencies is crucial for a secure Python project. And let's see what Miss Marple has to say about knowing your neighbors. So Miss Marple is up to date on the latest goings on. In software, this might mean keeping your dependencies as up to date as possible. That's a best practice because you get the latest security patches, things like that. It can also mean that you are aware of any late breaking news about recently found vulnerabilities in the libraries you use, that sort of thing. You don't want to be surprised to find that you're using a library that's had a known vulnerability for a long time, right? Miss Marple also has an understanding of the general character of her neighbors. So by this, I mean that you want to understand the projects that you're selecting to include in your application. You want to generally know what they're for, who contributes to them, what kind of oversight they get, what kind of security policies they have, things like that, just so you have a sense of whether issues will be resolved quickly, things like that. Miss Marple also knows who associates with whom. And by this, I mean, in software, you're going to want to know your immediate neighbors, the dependencies that you've chosen to include in your project, but you also need to know which dependencies they include in their project. So you want a full understanding of what packages you're using and what packages they're using and the vulnerabilities within. Miss Marple also is not shy to expose bad actors if necessary. And I think that that can sometimes be called for within open source security as well. My recommended read is The Murder at the Vicarage by Agatha Christie, if you want to meet Miss Marple. All right, so this is my neighborhood for one of the first projects that I ever worked on, just a personal project, things like that. And you can see here, it's a dependency tree. And you have your higher levels of packages that you have selected, that I've selected to use in this project. And then you have the lower levels of the packages that they use. And a problem is not only possible to be found like in that top layer, but in these bottom layers too. This dependency tree was generated for me through my sneak.io account. And I'm just using it because it's nice. It's a nice layout. All right, here is a chart that I show people when talking about dependencies and vulnerabilities in them and using dependencies. People tend to overestimate the percentage of their production code that is their original code. So you absolutely want to focus on making sure your code is handling inputs well, not dropping cookies, things like that. You want to be sure that you're handling those well. But a lot of the attack surface area isn't necessarily your original code. You may think that the production code is roughly looking like this, but really that slice of your original proprietary code can get really, really small. And so it's just extra important to take care of these dependencies because they represent a large attack surface for your project. And additionally, they potentially have known vulnerabilities, which means that someone has a map to get there, if that makes sense. So it's just something I like to show people. So what should you know about your neighbors? Well, I should know if any packages I use have known security vulnerabilities, and I should know which packages I am using indirectly. My dependencies have dependencies, and if they have vulnerabilities. So how do I keep track of these in Python? I recommend automating where you can. Researching and keeping track of all these things can be really hard. And there are both open source options and enterprise solutions that can help you do this. PyEnv has some interesting security and dependency tools for your Python environments. PyUp.io is a Python-based solution, and I recommend that. And then things like Sneak is an enterprise solution, but they have a rigorous freemium tier, so they're another good option. So we want to understand our open source dependencies and remediate known issues. You want to use a tool to help you do this, and there are open source options and enterprise options. All right, so our next question, are people who they say they are? And this section is really going to deal with authentication and permissions. And we're going to go to Hercule Poirot and Sherlock Holmes to learn more about this. A very common feature in these mystery stories is that someone is not who they say they are. They're in disguise, or they've hoodwinked you into, sorry, into thinking that they're someone else, that kind of thing. If there's an actor in the story, be suspicious. How do we confirm identity? Handwriting? Do we look at their mannerisms, their no mannerisms? Is it enough to say, oh, this looks like the person? Names, nicknames, and aliases become important. And there are a number of really fun books you can read that deal with identity. And I've listed them there. So what should you know about authentication in Python? First, I would say don't roll your own auth. Too much can go wrong, and there are just a number of options that you can use to do this that are safer. You know, the included auth in Django is good. You can do social auth. Auth can often be a very good thing, or outsource it to someone who knows what they're doing. Don't ever store plain text passwords. You won't be doing this if you don't roll your own auth. I think I got those negatives right, but don't store them in the database. Don't store them in text files on your computer. Don't do it. And it seems obvious, but it's caused problems for people before. I would also say that you should use two-factor auth on your personal accounts where you can. And, you know, this is a good personal privacy step, but it also can help protect your projects. I have, you know, some personal projects deployed, and because I've protected my Azure account with two-factor auth, things like keys and environment variables that I don't want out are safer because I have that extra layer of protection. So it can be good for personal, but it's also, it's more than that. If you are a package maintainer, if you have a PyPI account, they offer two-factor auth for that account. And that protects not only yourself, but the people that use your project. So you should use it wherever you can. Use 2FA and try to offer it for your project if at all possible, because it helps you, it helps your users. Finally, I would also say something important to know about authentication in Python is that Django doesn't throttle user authentications by default. So you should use a complementary tool to do so. So something like Django Defender would be really good in this case. Basically, you want to limit how often or how many total times someone is able to try to log into their account to prevent a bad actor from breaking in. All right. And I just wanted to give a short shout out to The Case of the Speckled Band, which is a Sherlock Holmes mystery by short story by Arthur Conan Doyle, where Sherlock Holmes literally prevents a snake from entering a room. So in thinking about authentication and Python, it's a fun read. All right. So what should I know about permissions? And I see authentication and permissions as inherently linked because first you want to be sure of who the user is, and then you want to be sure that they can only do actions that are relevant to who they are and what they're trying to do. So when I think of permissions, I think of badges at conferences where, you know, if you're at a big trade show or something, your badge will get you into the door, but it won't get you backstage. There's a different badge to get you backstage. There's potentially, you know, exhibitor badges, which will get you in at different hours. You want to be as granular as it is practical with these permissions because it's always easier and safer to grant an additional permission than it is to try to revoke one. You don't want to be, you don't want people who shouldn't be in certain places to be there. You need to think about your perimeters and ask yourself what users are acceptable in what areas and doing what things. All right. So treat authentication and permissions conservatively. Don't roll your own off, and be explicit about the perimeters in your project and apply permissions carefully. So my next question for our detectives is, should I trust this mysterious package? And we're going to be dealing with questions of injection, user uploads, deserialization, and typo squatting. So let's go to Sherlock Holmes to see what he would have to say on this issue. So Sherlock Holmes once took a case where a client received a package containing 3 severed ears. It's pretty gross, was not good. And in another case, a client received 5 orange pips, and it turned out to be a huge threat. A pip is a seed for fellow non-Brits, and it was one of 2 stories where a client died after seeking Holmes's help. So a mysterious package can be really detrimental to yourself, to your project, etc. So no, Holmes does not believe you should trust that mysterious package. So we deal with handling unknowns all the time. And something you may have heard said just colloquially is trust but verify. I'd say no, verify and then trust. Assume anything that comes to you from the outside could be compromising. So let's talk about injection briefly. The first thing I would say is to write raw SQL sparingly, if at all. It's a lot safer to use the Django ORM, for example, than executing raw SQL queries. Raw SQL, especially raw SQL that's a string and is formatted using user inputs, is potentially dangerous. And in general, string formatting should be done carefully in web apps. You want to protect yourself from injection and code execution. All right. So another thing that you should be suspicious of is user uploads and deserialization. So is your user uploading a picture? How do you know? It's important to check it is a picture and not, say, a script. not being careful with your user uploads can expose you to the risk of code execution. And then another question, have you received serialized data? If you unserialize it without being sure you fully trust the source, you can also have a problem with code execution. And there are actually like known instances of this within the Python ecosystem. You need to be really careful with NumPy and with Pickle, and NumPy uses Pickle. You want to be very careful with that, because if you get a serialized object and you deserialize it, like there's no way of knowing beforehand if that object is suspicious or could cause you problems. So you need to be really, really sure that you trust the source. All right. Next up, we have typo squatting. And for people who haven't heard of that before, basically it can happen when someone creates a malicious package and names it close to, but not exactly, a popular package. And that's why it's called typo squatting. You create a typo and then your malicious package sits there and waits for people to unknowingly download it. So never pip install a package without checking its name, without being sure that that's what you want. Go onto the website of pypi.org and check it out, because it's better to be safe than sorry. And recently, last year, someone was typo squatting on a package called Jellyfish. Then they misspelled it, but it was kind of a weird misspelling that really wouldn't happen so much if you were just typing or guessing. So then they typo squatted on a separate package that included the Jellyfish package. And all this stuff had to be removed from PyPI before too many people had downloaded it. And it's just an example. I believe it was dealing with like Bitcoins or something. I don't hold me to that, but you just want to be careful, and you want to know that what you're downloading is what you want. There are things where you can check hashes and things like that. And that's an excellent option if you're unsure as well. And just in general, don't guess. So be wary of inputs and uploads. And again, don't guess. All right. So here's another question for our detectives. And that is, how do you handle sensitive information? And this is something that actually it's important to all of us. And I'm going to focus on source code and user data. But this sort of idea is something that all three of our detectives have come across in their work. And so these detectives, they understand that information is valuable and that it has the potential to be dangerous. They tend not to reveal their hunches before the appropriate time. They will explain their methods when it's appropriate, but not before. And they don't always tell the authorities the full story, actually, because information is that sensitive and precious. These detectives, they have discussed for blackmailers who wield personal information as weapons. So we want to take these ideas and think about our source code and about user data. So above everything, you want to protect your source code. You need to follow good hygiene, regardless of whether the repository is public or private. If you have a private repository, I think it's best practice to operate as though it were public. So just because your repo is private doesn't mean you should be checking keys or passwords or anything like that into the repository. The privacy of the repository isn't a good enough threshold of safety, I guess I could say. You want to follow good hygiene regardless of whether that repo is public or private. Never commit sensitive information to version control. No keys, no passwords, no private information, nothing like that. And you should always be aware that you may have a problem from within your own house, and you should act accordingly around your source code. You know, you don't want to think any of your coworkers would do something compromising, but it's always possible. You don't know, and you need to treat the source code with the respect it deserves because of those things. All right, let's talk about user data. And what I like to think about here is that you should be selective. Do you need to collect that information? Do you need to store it? What data do you need? What data do you not need? And something that's important to remember is that you can't lose data that you never collected. So for instance, you know, I have a few smaller online shops that maybe I'll buy something from occasionally. They don't have my credit card on file. They don't even give me that option, right? And yeah, it's kind of annoying that if I want to buy from that store, I need to input my credit card information every time. But if they don't keep that data, if they don't store that data, they're not going to lose it. And that is a valid method of helping to protect your users' data. Past me was apparently more thoughtful because she knew what I meant by delegate. I'm not sure what I meant there, but probably something along the lines of it's okay to use third parties with increased security for things like processing payments, things like that. You want to give your users tools to help protect themselves. So that involves things like two-factor auth that we discussed earlier. And you should really view personal data like glitter. If it gets out, it's really hard to get back, and you have no control over where it goes. So the key here is to not collect more than you need, and to be very careful not to let it out. So I have to say about user data. Both source control and user data deserve careful consideration. You can't lose data you don't collect. And Git is amazing, but it's not for everything in your project. You should be very thoughtful about what you do commit and what you don't. You should never commit keys, passwords, or personal information. All right, I believe this is the last question that we have for our detectives. And that question is, are you up to date on your knowledge of cigar ash? And what I mean by that is that Sherlock Holmes had a habit of writing really long treatises on obscure topics that were nonetheless relevant to his field. So this is about the importance of continued learning and forward progress. So Sherlock Holmes is an excellent example of this. He was constantly learning about his field. He was an experimenter. He shared his findings with Scotland Yard, and he was willing to do things in new ways. And the point I really want to drive home here is that security is a continual process. You are never secure in a sense that you can just check it off your list. New vulnerabilities are found, new exploits and attack vectors are executed, so the work is always a work in progress. It's true on the personal level of your own safety, security, privacy, but it's true on the company and the industry level as well. And what's been really interesting and exciting to see is that the PSF is investing in this sort of thing. There have been a lot of interesting and exciting improvements over on the Python packaging tool, PyPI. And for instance, they now offer two-factor authentication as a login security option, API tokens for uploading packages, and the PSF has been putting money into this. And I think it's just a really exciting thing to see. And it's a good leadership step from their it's a good leadership step from them. And it would be awesome as a community if we followed suit in upping our own security game, just to match the exciting things that they're doing. So the takeaway here is that security is never done. Good security is a product of continual learning and of iteration. So to summarize, approach your code with skepticism. Don't make assumptions about it. Don't assume that it's fine just because you haven't had a problem yet. Ask questions and test theories. One really interesting and exciting way to level up your security game is to try to break something yourself. Hack yourself. See where your project may be vulnerable or weak. It was really exciting the first time I took part in a capture the flag game. Didn't win because, first time around. But it was really interesting to see those exploits live in a project and get an idea of how they work. So ask questions, test theories, and try to hack yourself or a sample project. OWASP has some interesting tools to help you do this, and they're something I would recommend. And another takeaway is that the security team is in your corner. Any security professional who is doing a good job, they won't be annoyed or sad or bummed that a developer has some security questions for them, or if they want to know more about this little corner of tech, right? They do not have, or there is simply not enough of them to carry the burden of software security solely on their shoulders. So if your job has security people on the team or on a parallel team, it is awesome if you could, or it's awesome if you could get their input and advice, and I think they would be delighted to hear from you. All right, I have some resources for you quickly before I go, and that includes a link to a few different things I've written, including some Python security tips, Django security tips, and more Python security articles. And so feel free to check those out. I'm going to post these slides on my Twitter, so you can find all the links there. So again, I'm Hayley Denbraver. I'm a Python enthusiast. I'm an experienced developer advocate looking for her next role. I'm a future Seattleite, so if anyone's from the Pacific Northwest and wants to drop tips or your favorite parks or places into the Slack, I'd love to hear that. You can find me at Hayley Denbraver on Twitter, which is where I'll be posting these slides later today. And I would love to hear from you there. And I also want to thank Noelle Cook for all of these awesome snakes. She made my dreams come true. I love them. But anyway, and I wanted to thank you and the team at 6 Feet Up for hosting this session and for coming to this talk. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. And I look forward to your questions in the gallery or wherever we go after this. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hayley. There's been massive outcry for you have to talk to Noelle about this on an autogenetic avatar generator. I think it's a
oh yeah, or get your own snake.
I think it's what people are calling them, so they can have their own.
Yeah,
that's too funny. So many great analogies there. That Slack is littered with them. So yeah, I'm sure you can guys look at this. Okay. We did have a question from Gregory. What did you mean exactly by don't create your own auth?
So simply what I mean there is that, so think about how you log in to a website. You know, you put your username or email and your password. There is a system where that password gets hashed and then checked against a stored hash in your database or something like that. And sometimes people are tempted to either store those passwords in the database without hashing them, or to create their own hash method, I guess. And either way, it can go really bad really fast. So it's a lot better to use the tools that are available, because the hash method, basically, it takes an item, in this case like a string, and creates this long second string that every time you input that same thing, it will match, but you can't take the hash and reverse engineer the original string from it. And those algorithms they've been determined by research and like really smart people who know what they're doing. And it's just better to go with that. That's what that meant.
For sure. Thanks. Let me see if I can, if there's any other questions here. Let me see. Marcos asks, can we trust on federated authentication through Twitter, Google, etc.?
You know, it's interesting. Security is always, it's about balancing risks, right? And there can be benefits both from, some people will find it easier and are more willing to sign up through something they've already signed up for. So like the ease of getting a new user might be easier through one of these social auths, I'd say. But then also, you know, if your project is small, you know, whether it's a personal project or even a small like work project, you are leaning on the security expertise of others. There is a risk there, but it's usually, or just because you don't know what their process is, but it's usually balanced because you know that they just have more resources to pour into that kind of thing. That's what I say.
Awesome. I don't see any other questions right now, but I'm sure actually one literally just came up. So here we go. Which method would you recommend to store important API keys, environment variables, and the like?
Yeah, I think that's going to depend a lot what technology you're using, that kind of thing. I know in personal projects, um, a lot of the cloud providers and stuff have really easy to use environment variable settings. And for me, just making sure I had that extra layer of two-factor auth to help protect those environment variables was enough for the kind of projects that I work on. But it's just more something you need to think about and apply to your specific technology and kind of your risk tolerance. So that's where I land.
For sure. For sure.
Mhm.
All right. Now I'm going to wait 5 seconds and see if I get any more questions. Because last time I tried to. All right. I think we're good. If anyone has any other questions, you can talk to Hayley in the breakout room. I'll post the link in here in the Slack channel. I know I've already seen some love, but let's give Hayley another round of applause. It was so great to have you. And thank you so much for being
Thank
here.
you. I really enjoyed it. Take
Awesome.
care.